It is my absolute pleasure and privilege to invite up Stuart Feinhor, who just returned from a 9-day voyage to Israel, to come up and share a teaching with us about this Torah portion and his journey. No, you can take it off and you're over here.
Hello, Shabbat Shalom. This will only take 45 minutes or so. In honor of my former Devar Torah students whom I coached here over a 10-year period, let me start by saying the name of our Torah portion is Tazria, which means, according to Robert Alter's New Translation, should a woman quicken with seed from the root Zion Resh Ayin to sow or scatter seed. It comes from the book of Leviticus. With its obvious reference to the Levites, Aaron's tribe, who are commanded to assist the Kohanim with their priestly duties, Leviticus is largely a law book. As I've heard Rabbi Bronstein proclaim, as the third and middle of the 5 books, it serves as the center spine, the law that holds everything together. And whereas the book of Deuteronomy has Moses calling out, Vayikra, to the people, here it is God calling to Moses, instructing him to instruct the people. It emphasizes ritual, legal, and moral practices rather than beliefs per se, in order to make the Israelites into a holy people, because number one, who brought us out of Egypt is holy. I hope it doesn't offend anyone's sensibilities if I say this is an icky portion. Icky and sticky. It concerns itself with childbirth as a source of uncleanliness or impurity, as well as with diseases of the skin that can make a person unclean and therefore be forced to isolate outside the group for a period of 7 days to start with. It even discusses wool or linen cloth that can also be rendered unclean until or unless the Kohen gives you the green light, or else the thing gets burned. It's chock full of what might be referred to in the rabbinic and scholarly literature as ooh words, or David ooh words. Discharges, eruptions, scaly affections, rash, swelling, boil, inflammation, and leprosy, which we know to be Hansen's disease, an infection caused by a slow-growing bacteria. Not a portion I was itching to read. Anyway, I think you get the picture. One thing, however, that I like about this legalistic part of the text, because Leviticus is notoriously short on narrative, is how it lets you know you've reached a conclusion, as it says at the end in verse 59, such is the procedure for eruptive affections of cloth, woolen or linen, in warp or in woof, or in any article of skin, for pronouncing it pure or impure. As some of you may know, and as Holly just said, I just got back from a shortest trip to Israel. This was my first time back in 31 years, half my lifetime ago. The impetus for the trip was the wedding of some friends from my Hebrew Union College days. The timing worked out well, too, in terms of travel restrictions and protocols around COVID. It was a perfect trip for me, and I'm grateful for the good wishes and blessings I received from Rabbi Green and others before I left. More than 2 years into this deadly pandemic, it doesn't take a degree from Brandeis, although I have one, to find similarities between the laws, rituals, and moral practices, which I put in quotations, of isolation and the authoritative pronouncements of pure, impure, clean, unclean, kosher, unkosher, which we read about last week largely in Shemini, applied to the afflicted of this portion, with those who have suffered from viral or bacterial infections in recent and distant pasts, including, of course, avian flu, TB, AIDS, COVID, and other forms of SARS. According to the Oxford English Dictionary in 1663, the word quarantine, which comes from the word for, as in the French quatre, meant a period of 40 days isolation. 40 days. I thought that was Jewishly familiar. At first glance, okay, at every glance really, the rituals and instructions in this portion, as well as in much of Leviticus, may seem strange, bizarre, gross, certainly based on ancient beliefs that naturally lack the brilliance of modern science. But from another vantage point, one could argue that the tradition provides an analogous attempt to protect the many, even at the expense of the afflicted few. Isn't this what the CDC, the World Health Organization, and similar agencies around the world do? Faced with infectious maladies that can spread through touch or breath or sex, our leaders must find ways to address, or one hopes, fix the problem. While today we might not equate eruptions of the skin with punishment from heaven, it's useful to appreciate, I think, our texts in these instances were trying to understand conditions that were probably quite baffling. It is clear in our text that the ancient Israelites tended to blame themselves first and accept or expect punishment for their sins against God and the covenant. I admit I did not expect to reach this conclusion when Rabbi Green asked me if I would offer tonight's drash. I typically approach these seemingly endless lists of do's and don'ts like most modern American progressive Jews, skim over them at best, skip over them more often than not. I don't go in for self-blame over a rash. On Monday, just Monday of this week, it's so weird, I was walking the 14,000 steps in and around the old city from the Jaffa Gate all the way down to the bottom of the city of David, just across from Silwan in the Kidron Valley, through the musty but largely dry and narrow underground tunnel that takes you all the way back up to the original south steps of the Temple Mount from the time of Herod. It's quite the trek that my guide, who actually once gave Rabbi Green and his congregation from Atlanta a tour as well, told me, that this trek includes remnants of over 100 mikvaot, or ritual baths, for that spiritual purification that was required in order to do the things they needed to do at the time it was needed to do them, especially on those 3 pilgrimages holidays. Standing on those same south-facing stairs that the high priest ascended to in order to utter the ineffable name on that one day of the year, one imagines the 100,000 pilgrims who needed to purify themselves before doing whatever the sacrificial cult demanded. It was sort of like the Madison Square Garden of its day, I guess. As we read in Kohelet, also known as Ecclesiastes, Ein kol chadash tachat hashemesh. There's nothing new under the sun. Our ancient ancestors were charged with building a nation of priests and a holy people. One can dispute the associations we make automatically, if unconsciously, regarding words such as pure and impure, kosher and unkosher, clean and unclean, and we should argue about those terms that can harm as much as heal. But in the end, and surprisingly for me, perhaps these Levitical pronouncements are not to be so swiftly dismissed as outdated, as in by thousands of years after all. That's why I find that line from Kohelet so comforting. Finally, even in an icky portion such as this, it's fun to discover a verse that brings succor to the heart and comfort to the old. V'ish, and if you know Hebrew, don't give it away. V'ish ki yimaret rosho Kareahu tahorhu. If a man loses the hair of his head and becomes bald, he is pure. Well, that's a relief. Shabbat shalom.
To learn from one of our beloved teachers who has taught so many, to learn from you. And I love that you came to a different conclusion than you thought you would. I love that you were changed by your experience. Thank you so much for giving us that beautiful insight to icky things. Thank you. Let's move to the